Welcome everyone to our final spring ITINs Open Doors webinar. My name is Nicole Wesley from TheDream.Us. We are excited to have you spend time today with our guest speaker and presenter, Professor Francine Littman from UNLV's school or law school, Boyd Law School. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're coming from, what school, maybe how classes are going. Hopefully they're going well. But this is a time where you'll be able to learn more about ITINs, the benefits of having one, and how to apply for an ITIN if you yet to have an ITIN. Next slide, please.
There we go.
I think, oh, there we go. Okay. And then before we kick it off to our guest speaker and expert, Professor Littman, just wanted to remind everyone that we have wonderful resources on our new ITIN website, TheDream.Us/ITIN. We have very helpful information, including these 3 documents that you see on the screen, an ITIN FAQ, how to determine if you already have an ITIN. We've had some of our scholars that didn't think that they had an ITIN, but when they read through this 1-pager on how to determine if you already have one, they then realized that they actually do. So that's a great resource for you there as well. And then the last one is ITIN application guide and goes step by step through how to apply for an ITIN. We also have helpful links at the very end of the page, such as our YouTube playlist, where we have all of these recordings plus more as it relates to ITINs and other helpful links to ITIN resources. With that, I will kick it over to Professor Francine Littman.
Thank you, Nicole, and your great Dream Team squad. I do want to make sure that everyone does look at this ITIN, everything you need to know about ITIN page, and share it with your colleagues across the country, because it's a wonderful resource, and it really applies to so many different people. And what's nice is Nicole and her team have linked resources on this page, and frankly I have not seen as expansive as a resource as this resource is. So I tell people to go look at this website because it's got all the current links, so absolutely do look at that. So what is an ITIN? This might be a review for some of you, but candidly, over the next, today's the 11th. And so over the next week, you are going to be hearing about filing tax returns on the news, in your emails, on YouTube, on Twitter, on what is the other thing? What's the one with, Melanie, help me here, with where people do little videos.
TikTok.
TikTok, yes, absolutely. Every resource, every social media. Facebook, I know, is old school, but everything, they're going to be talking about taxes. And so you, as a college student, need to be engaged and need to be thinking about it, not just for yourself, but a lot of my immigrant students are very engaged with their communities, including their parents and grandparents. Everybody needs to be thinking about this. So when you file a tax return, you must have a taxpayer identification number. What's interesting about that is many people, especially now if you're born in the United States, you get a Social Security number right away, very shortly after birth. In addition, if you recently come to the country and you can work, then what does happen is you'll get a social security number if you have work authorization from the Social Security Administration. If you don't have work authorization and you need to file a tax return, then you get something called an ITIN. And it's an acronym that stands for Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. This is issued by the Internal Revenue Service, not the Social Security Administration, like Social Security numbers. And the reason for that is you can only get one if you have a tax filing obligation. When you look at this number, it looks a lot like a Social Security number, the number of digits and dashes. However, it starts with a 9, the number 9. Anyone who has a number that starts with a 9, that is an ITIN. They've been issued since 1996 when the federal government decided to scrutinize the issuance of Social Security numbers, and they wanted to make sure someone had work authorization before they could get a Social Security number. I work with a lot of seniors who have Social Security numbers that do not authorize work, but are theirs. And they are theirs because they got them before 1996. ITINs are now issued on a letter. So if you get an ITIN, or if you've gotten one recently, you got a letter from the Internal Revenue Service. However, maybe your parents or grandparents or older siblings, when they got their ITIN, it was issued on a card. It no longer is because it was too easily confused with Social Security number. So who uses an ITIN to file their tax returns? Well, the answer is anyone who has to file a tax return who does not qualify for a Social Security number. So that does not necessarily mean someone who is unauthorized. There are individuals who invest in the US. So let's say somebody who is resident in Spain. Wouldn't that cool to be in Spain right now and be a Spanish citizen and living in Spain? But yet they invest in the US, or maybe they have rental property in the US. They then have to file a US tax return. And so they would need a tax identification number. What's interesting about that is they don't qualify for a Social Security number because they're not authorized to work. And so they would apply for and receive an ITIN. So it's not just unauthorized immigrants, undocumented immigrants who have ITINs. It's foreign investors in US businesses and anyone who doesn't qualify for a Social Security number, but who needs to file a tax return. But once you get a Social Security number, so if you qualify for, if you have work authorization through DACA, then you got hopefully a Social Security number. Once you get a Social Security number, if you had an ITIN previously, your ITIN no longer qualifies. And so you should not use your ITIN again. You should use your Social Security number again forever, not stop using it, even if you lose authorization. So once you get a Social Security number, that is the number you use, again, even if you lose authorization. ITINs are really, the purpose is, the way you get one is you demonstrate to the IRS that you have a tax filing obligation. However, because we're such a number-based society, what a lot of people do is they use those numbers, and a lot of businesses will have people use those numbers for their purposes, like opening an interest-bearing checking account, getting a home mortgage, getting a driver's license in some states, you provide your ITIN. Getting sending your documentation, your information for information reporting regarding a fellowship or even a scholarship. If you're an independent contractor and you are providing services to some business, maybe you're consulting on a myriad of different things, how to apply to college, you would provide your ITIN. So starting a business in order to get an employer identification, you provide your ITIN. So you use the ITIN to comply with filing obligations and also to access any types of tax credits. And so tax credits are typically only for US citizens, but that's not true in all cases. But more recently, during the pandemic, you probably saw and heard about the economic impact payments. Those were accessed via tax filings. In addition, there are some tax filings for tax credits for college students like you. And in order to claim them, you need an ITIN. And for the educational tax credits, which are for higher ed, you do not need to be a US citizen. You can claim them with an ITIN, and maybe your parents are claiming them on your behalf. In order to demonstrate you've been in this country for an extended period of time, you often need to present your tax returns if you have a tax filing obligation. And so it's really important to file tax returns so you can show that you were physically present here, that you've been residing in the United States, that you have been complying with federal income tax requirements. A lot of immigration judges look at that as presenting good moral character. It might show your marital status. It could also show your dependents if you have children. You might, as Nicole said, you might already have an ITIN and not even know it. Why might you have one? Your parents are filing tax returns and claiming you as a dependent. If they have been, then you likely have an ITIN. They might not even really realize that because so much of what we do now in tax compliance is online. So it's not, it's more covert than overt. And a lot of folks don't actually look at their tax returns because they just submit them electronically. And what do they look for? They look for their tax refund, and where they look for that is in their bank account. So you should ask your parents if they've been filing tax returns to look at those tax returns. And on the front page of the tax return, on page 1, it's going to say dependents. And it should have, if they've claimed you, your name, and then right after that, your taxpayer identification number. It'll also say your relationship, which typically is going to be daughter, son, etc. And so that's where you might find it. They also might have it in the original ITIN assignment letter. I know a lot of immigrants I work with, they keep their important papers in a special file, and so they might have those papers for you. Definitely ask them to see if you have one, because if you already have one, you want to use that number. But if you don't have one, how do you get one? Well, you have to apply for one to the Internal Revenue Service. How you do that is by submitting a W-7. It's a form, and if you Google it, it'll pop up. Or you can go to that great website that has links to everything. W-7 is 1 page. It really isn't that difficult to fill out. The more challenging part of applying for an ITIN is the documentation to prove you exist, which seems kind of crazy because we look at you, we know you exist, but you have to prove you exist to the federal government, showing that you're foreign born and that you're physically present here in the United States. So how does this work? Well, it is a 1-page form, as I said, a W-7, and there's a couple boxes that are more challenging to try to navigate. The first one is at the top. It's so interesting that one of the biggest errors on this form is not checking one of these boxes. So at the very top of the form, you're either applying for a new ITIN if you don't already have one, or you're renewing your existing ITIN. And so you check one of those. If you don't check either, they're going to kick it back. So you need to check one of those. Then why are you submitting this form? Well, here we have some terms that are tax terms, and they are somewhat arguably inconsistent with immigration terms. And so don't think about them from an immigration law perspective, think about them from a tax perspective. And so the first two, A and B, are non-resident aliens. So that is someone who is not physically present in the United States and are not a US citizen. So that's going to be for foreign investors, and that is likely not you. The more common one is C, that you're a US resident, alien, and alien means you're not a citizen. US resident means you're physically present in the United States based upon number of days. And frankly, the number of days is 183. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But if you've been in the United States for more than half the year and you're still here and on a certain type of visa, then you are treated for federal tax purposes as a US resident. And then you're subject to tax on your worldwide income. So C is likely the box you'll check. When your parents claimed you, if they did claim you on their return, they'd check box D, that they're a dependent of a US citizen or a resident alien. So that would be your mom or dad claiming you. If you're married to a US citizen or resident alien, then you check that box in order to file with them. And then F is for students that are, or professors that are on certain visas that are treated for tax purposes as not being here, but that's not you. And so you are likely going to check box C. Then you put your name and address. Pretty straightforward. Don't worry about including your address because the IRS statutorily is barred from sharing your information with other federal agencies unless there is some sort of criminal investigation or other heightened scrutiny. So they are required to keep your information confidential. If you don't have a foreign address, which you likely don't, leave it blank. You put your birth date, your country of birth, any box that says optional, you don't need to fill in. You put your gender, your country of citizenship, so it's important to put that one. And then your foreign tax ID number, that box is usually blank. Box 6C is usually blank because you don't have a visa. And then 6D is an important box. And that is a box where you're going to submit your documentation to prove you exist. So this is the scary part because here you have to potentially submit original documents like your passport. And that generally is not something we encourage anyone to do, including legally present US citizens, because needless to say, the IRS is a big agency. By the way, they process about 160 million tax returns. So they've got a lot of paperwork. And so adding yours to the pile isn't something anyone would feel comfortable doing. But the good news is there's an alternative. But you're going to have to, the passport is the best form of document to submit because it covers all bases. It has a picture of you. So we know that's you. It identifies you as a foreign person. It also shows that you're present here. And so that's the best documentation. You need to put the number, who it's issued by, expiration date. And here you put your date of entry into the United States. This is something that I've worked with taxpayers who maybe don't remember the exact date, but if you can ballpark it, this is not, government doesn't have records either of your entry. And so if you guesstimate here, that's good enough. You know, I work with a lot of seniors who maybe don't remember. And so we'll say, was it warm? If it was hot, maybe it was summer. So say July 1st of that year. If you already have an ITIN, then you might be applying to renew it. If you haven't used your ITIN in the last 3 years, consecutive years, then your ITIN has expired and you need to renew it. And so here you would check the box yes, you would enter your ITIN number. And that's it. If you don't have an ITIN, you'll check no, and you'll go straight down to signing the application. So as you can see, this is a really straightforward form. Unfortunately,
Professor
though, because the
Lippman?
IRS likes to make things, yes.
Professor Lippman, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Your video and audio is a little choppy.
Okay.
Could you try muting or turning off your video and see if that
Absolutely
works? Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for interrupting. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. And so the instructions for the W-7 are 14 pages long, which is kind of shocking when you think about it, given that it's a one-page form. But the good news is you'll have this PowerPoint and you have my explanation, which is worked through all of the issues you really need to focus on. What I want to focus on is what needs to go with that form, because the cell is actually pretty straightforward, except you need to check. In order to get an ITIN, you have to have a tax filing obligation. And so what that means is you can't submit your ITIN without a tax return. And so now is a good time to submit it because most people are working on their 2022 tax return. So if you have a 2022 tax filing obligation, then you want to complete a W-7 and you're going to submit that W-7 with your tax return. Because you can't file your tax return electronically because you don't have a taxpayer ID, you're going to have to send that tax return with the W-7 and with copies, either originals or certified copies of your identity and foreign status documents. Again, there's an alternative to mailing them into the IRS, but all of that paper needs to be submitted to the IRS office in Texas. Austin, Texas is where it all goes. So what sort of documentation can you use to prove up your identity? And as I said, the best documentation is your passport, because it proves both your identity and also your foreign status. If you don't have a current passport, then you might consider a U.S. driver's license. Less common is a foreign driver's license, a U.S. state ID, U.S. military ID. If you have any of these, then these prove your identity. It's important that you use these particular documents and because they have a photo. In order to prove your identity or foreign status, so you'd need one that proves your identity, one that proves your foreign status. Passport does both. You don't have a valid passport that's current, then what you need to do is use one of these other documents for identity and then a separate one for foreign status. So foreign status, the most common one that I see is your birth certificate. Some other ones that I've seen less often are your U.S. Citizen and Immigration Service photo ID, foreign military ID, national identification card. I have seen that here in Nevada. And for kids under 6 who likely don't have, obviously they don't have a driver's license, medical records will work. School records if somebody's under 18. So perhaps for a child if you have a dependent child. So these are the documents that work. As I said, unfortunately, these have to be mailed in, and generally the original. Passport's the one document that covers both. So what can you do if you don't want to mail in these documents, which I don't blame anyone if they don't want to mail them in. And that is, you can use a certified accepting agent. It's a certified accepting agent. And what they do is they authenticate documents. What I mean by that is, and I happen to be a CAA, that's the acronym, we can look at the document, and because we're trained forensically, we can ensure that it's not fraudulent. And then we sign off on a form that goes with your tax return and your W-7 to the IRS. If you do that, then you do not have to submit your original documents. Again, great link from the IRS website. Also great link on the TheDream.Us website. There is a listing of CAAs. Unfortunately, many of them, most of them probably charge fees. And so when you are searching for a CAA, make sure you call them first. Make sure that you know what they're going to charge and how the process works. Another way is to go to the IRS office. IRS has taxpayer assistance centers. Again, there's an office locator. You put in your zip code and these opportunities will pop up. One of the problems with these taxpayer assistance centers is they're very busy, especially this time of the year. By the way, speaking of that, it does take during this time of year, because the IRS is so busy, this time of year, get an ITIN is very slow. I would say it's at least 3 months, maybe even longer. And so these CAAs will really help you process your form and also authenticate your documents. The best way to navigate this is with VITA programs. So the VITA program, volunteer income tax assistance programs. So what they do is they will take your information, prepare a tax return for you, And some of these volunteer income tax assistance programs also offer free CAA services. There aren't too many of them, but they are available, and they're probably very busy right now. But what you might be able to do is contact them, set up an appointment, even if it's after tax season, because it's really important to use competent preparers. And so how do you find competent preparers? Volunteer income tax assistants. They are trained. They have software that the IRS has procured. They are, they have integrity. They cannot discriminate. They have confidentiality requirements. And so it's a really good resource. I know in Nevada, our VITA programs operate year round. And so if you can't get in before next week, then it's important to consider even going after tax season. Here's some more links. Another way perhaps to navigate this opportunity is to, if you go onto the IRS website at free file, if you pull up irs.gov and you go to the front page, you will see a button or a link that says, do your taxes for free. That is online software that is free. You could prepare your tax return online and then print it out. You will not be able to electronically file if you don't have an ITIN, because it won't accept it without a taxpayer identification number. So that's one option of preparing your return, again, for free. VITA is another option. And the third option on this list is low-income taxpayer clinics. So low taxpayer clinics are a great option for navigating the federal government tax system if you have received a letter from the IRS, if you owe them money and can't pay it. They are located throughout the country in most major cities. Again, there's a great map at the link provided here, or the link on your ITIN page for TheDream.Us. What if you feel like you're stuck? It is a good idea. If you can't find a VITA program, you can't seem to find a CAA, and you don't know what to do next, you might find a low-income taxpayer clinic in your state. Contact them. They likely cannot help you directly, but they very well might have a referral. And so I would contact them to see if they have any referrals for you. Explain your situation. They too are have integrity, have professional ethics and confidentiality. So I'm confident they will help you. If you do end up using a paid preparer, and frankly, that might be your only alternative, make sure you talk to them beforehand about how much it's going to cost. If you do use a paid preparer, there are some referrals at the IRS website, but make sure you are using a paid preparer that has good references, because there are a lot of unscrupulous paid preparers out there. Make sure you look at the tax return. Don't be intimidated if you're paying for this. You certainly have the opportunity to review the return. You absolutely must get a copy of it. They must sign your return if they're a paid preparer under professional obligations. They need to sign it. make sure when you look at the return that it makes sense, that it's got your name on it and doesn't have some dependents on there that you don't know who they are. In addition, the IRS communicates with you through the mail. And when I say mail, I don't mean email, I mean US Postal Service. So open your mail, make sure you have your mail forwarded, make sure that you are responsive to mail. If you don't respond to mail, they can assess a lien on your bank accounts. And so be responsive to the IRS. And let's see, here's this great resource. It really is phenomenal. I have also answered lots of questions from Dream scholars that have emailed me, so don't hesitate to email me if you have a question, but certainly access these great resources that have been put together with embedded links. And the good news, bad news is this is the last ITIN office hours, and next week is the tax filing deadline. So make sure you get your tax returns in. If it's late and the government owes you, that's okay, but time is of the essence. So now I'm happy to answer any questions that have come in the chat. And I'll let Nicole navigate that process.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Lippman, for your expertise and knowledge about all things ITINs. We do have some questions in the chat, and as a reminder for those of you, if you have a question, feel free to put in the chat. You can also private message me and I can ask on your behalf. But the first question that we have was from earlier, and it's how often do you renew an ITIN number?
Great question. And one of the reasons I say great question is a Social Security number never expires. However, never say never, right? Because the federal government can change the rules, but if a Social Security number, that never expires. ITINs, though, if you do not use your ITIN 3 consecutive years in a row on tax returns, so if you miss 2 years and then you use it, it will not expire. If you don't use it for 3 consecutive years in a row, then it does expire. And then you're going to have to renew it with the tax return, with the W-7, and with the documentation. So the moral to the story is don't let it expire. Don't let it expire. File those tax returns.
Thanks, Francine, for answering that question. And that is a frequently asked question we get. That is also found on our ITIN FAQ on our website. I will also mention too, I know, thanks Melanie for putting all those links in the chat. A lot of those links, especially those free and low cost resources, you can also find on our ITIN webpage in our ITIN application guide. Next question is, can an undocumented student without a work permit file for an ITIN?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, if you have a tax obligation, you must file a tax return, but you have to have a tax filing obligation. What does that mean? If you worked and earned income through either as an employee, so you got a W-2, then you need to file a tax return. If you were an independent contractor, or were paid cash, babysitting, or doing yard work, or whatever, then you need to file a tax return. And so then you can get an ITIN. In addition, if you are a student, a college student, like most of you are, and you pay out of pocket for any higher education in the first 4 years of college, and I know many of you are so fortunate to be a Dream Scholar and get much of your tuition paid, but to the extent you're paying out of pocket for any tuition and or required books and equipment, there is a tax credit that you can file for, but you need an ITIN. So that is a filing requirement. And one question that I'm seeing popping up, and I just want to address it, if you receive a scholarship and you use it for higher ed tuition and or required books, you do not have to include that in income. So that is not taxable income.
Thanks, Francine, for answering those two questions. Next question is similar to the question I just asked. When it comes to the renewing process and having to file a tax return, how do we file a tax return if we don't have a job?
Again, great question, but so if you don't have a job or you didn't earn any income, then the kind of begs the question, well, who's taking care of you? Who's providing your support? And that might be a parent. And so maybe a parent is claiming you as a dependent. If you're a full-time student and under 24, they can claim you. So that might be a way to get an ITIN, have a parent include you as a qualifying dependent. Or if you're going to college, like most of you are, and you have any expenses above and beyond your scholarship, and unfortunately that doesn't include room and board, so it's just tuition and fees and required books and equipment. So if you have out-of-pocket expenses, then you can file for a tax credit, and that is a filing obligation, and that would allow you to get an ITIN.
Thanks, Francine. These are some great questions that we see coming in. Next question. We're supposed to pay the IRS, but how exactly can we work anywhere without a social security number? And I can take this, and Francine, you can add to it if you'd like. As mentioned, if you do not have a work permit, you can apply for an ITIN and use an ITIN to generate income through starting your own business, becoming an independent contractor, doing freelance work. So that is what I will respond to that. I don't know, Professor Littman, if there's anything else you'd like to add on to that.
Right. So if you're not, if you don't have work authorization, then you can't be an employee, but you can be an independent contractor. Or if you have interest income, if you have a little bit of savings, that is generating some income. Or, as I said, if you have out-of-pocket expenses above and beyond scholarships for tuition and fees, and or required books and equipment, then this tax credit would allow you to file a tax return.
Thanks for that question. Next question. Where can I work if I were to have an ITIN? What companies accept that? So I can take that question. So with an ITIN, you can generate income through entrepreneurial career pathways. So if you have an ITIN, you cannot work in a W-2 or as an employee, but you can be self-employed through entrepreneurial career pathways, such as starting your own business, doing independent contract work, and freelancing. You could look at some freelancing platforms such as Upwork or Fiverr to give you an idea. We will also be hosting a summer career series later this year in the summer for our scholars as well as in our alumni that will be focusing on entrepreneurial career pathways to give you some more in-depth information about that. Next question, and I think you answered the one about scholarships, Professor Lippman. So I will go to the next one. Do you have to renew or apply for a new ITIN if you haven't renewed since 2018?
So if you have an existing ITIN and you would never apply for a different one. So if you have had an ITIN, you're going to renew that ITIN. So 2018 is more than 3 years, and so you would need to renew it. And the way you renew it is filing a tax return and a W-7 and submitting documentation that hopefully a passport and hopefully getting it authenticated by a certifying acceptance agent. So same process, renewal or not. It's renewal or initial application is really the same process now. Renewal, the only difference is you check the renew box at the top, and then on the W-7, you put your ITIN number.
Professor Lippman, there's a direct message question, and that question is, can someone who's in the process or wait list of getting a green card apply for an ITIN number?
Yes, absolutely. If you have a tax filing obligation, you would apply for an ITIN. Unfortunately, as we all know, things take so long with the government that hopefully you would get your ITIN before you got your social security number. So it is not unusual that people have an ITIN and then they get a social security number. And so if you're in that situation, you are supposed to send the IRS a letter letting them know this was my ITIN number. Now this is my social security number. Please take my file and put it onto this file. I've also talked to folks who have DACA and have social security numbers. Another thing we suggest they do is they contact all the credit agencies and let the credit agencies know to move their ITIN information over to their social security number. That might be something people might want to do.
Thanks, Professor Lippman. Another direct message question. What do you do if you lost your ITIN number? Do you file for a W-7?
So if you lost the number, then what I would suggest you do. So first I would try to find it if you haven't already. And one way you could try to find it is by looking on your parents' tax returns. So that's one way if they've claimed you. If that's not successful, then there is an email address for the ITIN program, and it's probably on the website, the ITIN website, and you can, there's also, I believe, a phone number that's probably more difficult to get through. You can call them and try to find that number. It is very challenging if you've lost it and can't find it to try to get it back. But and I guess in a worst case scenario, you might apply for another one. And what would be wonderful is if they came back and said, oh, you already have one. And this is the number. So I would navigate it in that manner.
The next question is, I have an ITIN. My parents have always put me on the taxes. My question is, they received a card saying I had to change the ITIN number. How do I change the ITIN number? Would it fall under a renewal?
So it sounds to me like they're saying you need to renew it. And so I don't know how we change the ITIN number unless they were saying the name. If you had a name change, something like that, but I would renew. It sounds like it's a renewal.
The next question is, when's the last day to do taxes? Where the answer is Tuesday, April 18th. But a follow-up to that question is, when can you apply for an ITIN?
So here's a good, so that's a really good question. So in order to timely file, the due date is April 18th. However, it's more complicated than that. And if you are expecting a refund, you can file up to 3 years after the due date and still get your refund. If you owe money, you will owe them that money forever. And if you don't pay it by April 18th of 2023 for 2022, they're going to charge you interest and penalties until you pay it. And so while next Tuesday feels like a hard and fast deadline, for refunds, it really isn't. If you owe after that date, so the penalties can be up to 25%, which is a big number. And then on top of that, the interest is basically, it's based upon the short-term rate plus a couple percentages. And so right now, as we know, interest rates are going up. And so it could be as high as 7 or 8%. And that's top of the penalty. And so that's why you really need to pay by April 18th. If you're owed a refund, you can file up to 3 years after the due date. But not surprisingly, the federal government's not going to pay you interest on your refund if you haven't asked for the money.
Thanks, Professor Lippman, for that response. Another question that's a direct message. If you have an ITIN number, can you file taxes electronically via TurboTax, for example? And do you need to send the ITIN letter with the tax return to the IRS?
Great question. No, you can file electronically with an ITIN. You don't need to send them any documentation for your ITIN. And Turbo should accept that just like any other number. So it should not be a problem. And it should not be a problem even if you're, let's say, married to someone who has a social security number. So that person has a social, you have an ITIN, they'll accept it without a problem.
Here's another great question that's a direct message. If someone is single, should they file taxes and apply for an ITIN number if their salary was less than $12,000?
Yes, because you want to file. You are in a more precarious position than a lot of folks, and you want to document that you are physically present in the United States, and more importantly, if it's W-2 wages, then there has probably been withholding taken out. And so the federal government owes you a refund. So claim that refund. And by the way, if you don't claim that refund within 3 years, the statute of limitations runs and you will never be able to get that money back, even if you owe them money, the IRS money. In addition, you want to document where you were. And if you don't file, the IRS can come in and say, oh, assess you, the statute of limitations doesn't start running. So they could say, oh, if there's identity theft or something, oh, you earned all this income and you owe us. Well, if you didn't file, you're not on record at all. So it really is important to file, get your refund, do it timely. Then, Nicole, I'm sure you've had to go back and for a license or for a loan or something, document where you were for certain times in your life history. And it's really much easier if you have those tax returns to be able to look at your address and what you were doing. It kind of is a nice record that you can have.
Yes, that's a great point, Professor Littman, is that tax returns can be a great record to have on file and refer back to. Next question, how do you file for an ITIN outside of the tax season?
Same way. The IRS is open 7/24, 365 days a year. And so same exact way. I mean, their offices aren't open, but online it's available. So outside of tax season, one of the downsides though is a lot of VITA programs do shut down after tax season, but more and more of them are not shutting down and trying to be open year round. And so it might be easier for you to navigate outside of tax season because the ITIN application process is a little bit more complicated than a traditional tax return.
That's good to know that some VITA programs are staying open year round. And as a reminder to our scholars, not only can you look at some of these helpful links that we've posted in the chat, but also a lot of VITA programs are on college campuses or in the surrounding community.
Yes.
So feel free to ask your scholar advisor or a professor at your college and ask if they know where the VITA programs are. Usually faculty within the business or accounting departments at colleges tend to volunteer with these VITA programs. So that's something that you can take a look at. We are rounding down to the hour. I will ask one last question, and this is a direct message. I am about to be 24 in November, and my parents already filed their tax return for this year. Can I ask them to file for me as a dependent next year, or is that too late?
It's too late next year because it sounds like you're going to be 24 this year. And so then you won't qualify as a dependent. There is the possibility of amending a return and adding you as a dependent, or you could potentially file your own tax return for 2022 if you have out-of-pocket higher education expenses that you could claim for the American Opportunity Tax Credit.
And Professor Littman, I'm going to ask this one last question.
Of course.
Because I think the answer is valuable. I've heard that if you make less than a certain amount of money in a year, for example, $500, it's not required to file for taxes. Is that true or misinformation?
So the answer is always not straightforward. in that if you make $500 as an independent contractor, then you actually are required to pay self-employment taxes. And so you would want to file a tax return to pay your self-employment taxes. The cutoff for self-employment taxes is $400 or less. So 500 is above that. So you should file. You'd have to pay self-employment taxes, but you wouldn't have to pay any income taxes. Again, if it's a W-2, then they would have taken out the Social Security, the payroll taxes, but there might be some federal withholding that you might want to get back. I had a law student one time who had less than the standard deduction amount, and the federal government withheld like $50. And I said, well, file to get that $50 back. That's your money. So, and on top of all these reasons, it's just important to have a record to demonstrate, if you're on a path to citizenship someday, that you filed and you paid your taxes. In addition, some of you perhaps apply for different scholarships. Being able to present a tax return is helpful for that. Also, having a record of where you were and what you were doing is very helpful. If you're going to apply for a loan, to have the record of tax returns. And you might not need it today, but maybe 3 years from now you will. And if you have an ITIN, every year you don't file, you are more at risk of having your ITIN expire. And so kind of, if any reason to file so that your ITIN does expire.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Lippman, for your expertise. Thank you for all of our attendees for your time today and getting all of your questions answered. If you do have any lingering questions, you see Professor Lippman's email on the screen. I also put it in the chat. Definitely don't hesitate to reach out to Professor Lippman. She's mentioned to me that a number of the TheDream.Us scholars have reached out to her. So feel free to use her as a resource. And we will be posting this recording on our YouTube page, and we'll be sharing out the slide deck as well later on this week. So thank you everyone for your time and enjoy the rest of your week.
Happy tax season.